So let's review for our Lecture 16 quiz. We've talked quite a bit about the principles of evolution as well as the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Most of your questions are going to be on the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and the principles of evolution. You've got about 3 questions that are going to deal on concepts such as the theory of evolution, what natural selection is, the difference between natural selection and artificial selection. So let's go over those first, and then we'll kind of go through some of these other ones on the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and the principles of evolution. So as we've been talking, we've been giving some examples of what evolution is, certain scenarios in which natural selection is occurring today, as well as some examples of how evolution is occurring. And so that's where about 3 of your questions on your exam are. So make sure you can define evolution. Remember, it is descent with modification, common ancestry, and changes in allele frequency over time. Basically, these are all ways in which we describe how alleles get transmitted from one generation to the next over time. And because of mutations that continue to arise, you get these modifications that occur generation after generation, and that you see this common ancestry amongst many of these species. Now, as far as the questions generally go, they're going to ask you scenarios and other concepts such as how natural selection can occur. So let's go over again how natural selection occurs, because it doesn't always happen. There are certain environments where there is no natural selection. You must first have diversity. There has to be something to select for. There has to be some struggle to survive. And then in that struggle to survive, those that have the alleles that give them the phenotypes that allow them to survive, they have the advantage to pass those on to the next generation. And over time, you get a shift or change in allele frequency because those alleles become more common in the environment. Now, natural selection is a strong driving force, but as we mentioned, it is not synonymous with evolution, right? Because there are many other ways that evolution can occur. So these first 3 questions really just focus on natural selection, and then the others look at a lot of the other principles of evolution. One of the questions you're going to have is essentially going to ask why you have certain alleles that seem problematic that continue to exist in the population. For example, we gave ideas such as sickle cell anemia. The allele carrying people are protected against malaria. If you carry the allele for cystic fibrosis, you're protected against cholera, Tay-Sachs, against tuberculosis. This is what we call heterozygote advantage. So keep that word in mind for one of the test questions, because that has everything to do with natural selection. If you're in the right environment and you have that allele, you have the advantage over others. And this one's a rare scenario because normally these alleles are either not advantageous or advantageous. This is one of those alleles that in the wrong environment is bad, and in the right environment is very good. And so that's why when we say people that have a recessive allele but have the normal phenotype, they have the advantage, which we call heterozygote advantage. You'll also have a scenario where I give you something from one of these 3, either pesticide resistance, antibiotic, or innate immunity to HIV. And each scenario basically presents 2 possible outcomes. In one outcome, if you introduce a pesticide and none of the insects have resistance, it'll ask what will happen. Well, the right answer you'll be looking for is that all the insects die. And that's because the wrong answers give you scenarios where they rapidly mutate to adjust to the new pesticide, and that just doesn't happen in reality. Basically, the alleles must either exist in the population to be selected for, or they don't exist. Because mutations are random and they're not goal-oriented, like natural selection is not goal-oriented, it basically says what's available for the species, and if that's available, then that's what's selected for. The same thing is true for pesticide resistance and antibiotic resistance. If you treat a bacteria with an antibiotic and they don't have any resistance, they're all dead. There's nothing that's going to happen that allows them to survive because it pretty much kills off all of them. Innate immunity to HIV, again, some people in the world have these mutations that give them the ability to survive an infection of HIV and they don't develop AIDS. Well, other people don't have this, and this is where a lot of the diversity of our species comes into play. And so if you had this become a more severe condition that would kill people not in months, but in days or whatnot, you might have something that, has a higher selection. And especially if this were to spread rather than just through fluids and whatnot, if it were to spread like the flu, then you would start to see an insane amount of selection for this allele. And that was the case with the bubonic plague. This is the actual same mutation that people had with the bubonic plague, and people that had it were immune to the bubonic plague. They survived and passed that on with greater frequency, centuries ago. And it's the same mutation today. So in any of those scenarios, again, what you're looking for is if they have the resistance, then those that have it survive and they pass that on, and that becomes more predominant. If they don't, they die. That's really the two things you're looking for this. Now, you also want to be able to know the difference between artificial selection and natural selection. Artificial selection is when we choose what we want to breed in the plant or in the animal. This does not always coincide with natural selection because we're choosing the color of the dog's, hair, or we're choosing various traits that may have nothing to do with their own type of selection. And so we've been doing it for quite a while. Sometimes it coincides with natural selection. More often than not, it doesn't. And so that's the main difference. Natural selection, it's the environment that puts pressure on the species to survive. Artificial selection, we like the tomato to taste good. So we choose these tomatoes and we keep breeding them. That has nothing to do with natural selection or sexual selection or anything. It doesn't give them an advantage. And so that's what artificial selection is. So you're going to have three scenarios. Typically, I'll talk about, what would happen under this condition with natural selection. What's the difference between natural selection and evolution? Again, natural selection is a principle of evolution. It's not evolution itself, but it is one of the driving forces of evolution. Evolution can be defined by any one of these ways. Now, the other questions you're going to have come down to the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. There's 2 questions on the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, and then there's 5 questions on the principles of evolution. Here's one of your questions on the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. If you remember from lecture 15, we learned how the distribution of alleles can be determined by the Punnett square, the law of segregation. And all this equation illustrates is the distribution of alleles between homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive individuals. And so the P allele represents the dominant allele, the Q allele represents the recessive allele, and the 2PQ is the heterozygous. So that's what this essentially illustrates. So on one of the questions on the exam, I'm going to say 2PQ started off at 25% and now it's 50% after a century. What does that tell us? And you'll say, something happened to where people who were heterozygous had the advantage. And we talked about that, like in malaria and sickle cell anemia, that people who have this recessive allele have the advantage. And that's some way where you can see, hey, evolution's occurring because we're getting a shift in allele frequency. And so that's all this equation essentially says is there is a shift in the allele frequency. Now, what's causing that requires usually further investigation, but I'm just simply going to test you on what these values mean because it's one of the ways in which we track allele frequency shifts in the population. So if I say that P squared increases, you would say that the dominant trait became more favorable. If I say that Q squared increases, then you would say that the recessive trait became more favorable in that environment. Okay, so that's one question. The second question is going to test you on all of the principles of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And these are, again, the no change scenario. And the way in which I'm going to test you on it is basically saying which of the following will cause evolution to occur. Well, if you have no mutations, all mating is random, no gene flow, the population is large to avoid genetic drift, and no natural selection, basically that is no evolution. So what you'll be looking for is a deviation from one of these hypothetical scenarios, okay, where you do get mutations. That mating is non-random. We call that sexual selection, where you do get gene flow. That's the migration in or out. Or the population is small. That's the deviation here, because genetic drift is always in play. That's the law of segregation. But if the population is small, remember, you get dramatic shifts in allele frequencies just due to chance, as opposed to large populations that have a very resistance to shifts in allele frequencies just due to chance. And then natural selection, of course. So that's what you'll be looking for. There's 5 different questions with 5 different scenarios, and they're just looking at which one of these changes, which one of these is a deviation of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, because that's how we determine how fast a population is evolving. If all of these are occurring, population small, a lot of natural selection, a lot of gene flow, a lot of sexual selection, a lot of mutation, then it's a very rapidly evolving population. Usually it's just a couple of these, but that's why we have the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, to illustrate what all the principles of evolution are. So that's one of your questions on it as well. Now, the remaining 5 questions are basically going to be the principles of evolution, the 5 scenarios of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, the 5 principles. And each one, I'm going to describe them, and you're going to say, oh, that's sexual selection. Oh, that's mutation. That's gene flow. The only one that's a little different is genetic drift. Sometimes I test you on the founder effect or the bottleneck effect. So let's make sure we know the difference between these 3. Genetic drift is the law of segregation. It is always happening, always. So this is the principle of allele frequency change based upon the random chance that someone who is heterozygous for some gene is going to pass on the dominant versus the recessive allele, right? It's just a 50-50 chance. So in large populations, there is very little evolution due to genetic drift, because statistically speaking, it's, the house always wins. When it comes down to, plain chance, the house always wins. So when you get a large enough population, chances are you're not going to get much fluctuations. But when you get a really small population, that means that over a short period of time, you can get very drastic changes in the allele frequency just due to chance. Now, there's 2 ways in which the population can get really small. The founder effect, and that's where I'll usually use a group like the Amish to describe this effect, and that is where you get a group of people that are reproductively isolated from the rest. This can also be through migration, where you have like pioneers or pilgrims coming over and forming their own colonies. That's also the founder effect. The bottleneck effect, this is when you have a catastrophe that wipes out a large portion of the population, thus causing only a few to survive. So either one of these is ultimately what leads to genetic drift becoming more prominent, because you're going to go from a large population to a small population, or you're going to go from a large population in the bottleneck effect to a small population. So that's why these are in conjunction with this. But just make sure you know genetic drift is the principle. Founder effect and bottleneck effect are events that reduce the population size, because I may test you on these as well. Natural selection, make sure you know the difference between abiotic and biotic, because I'm going to say which of the following is not a biotic component of natural selection. And I'm going to give you 3 scenarios: competition over resources, predator-prey relationship, and parasite spread. And then I'm going to give you something like, annual fluctuations in rainfall and whatnot. And that's the one you'll say, oh, that's abiotic, that's non-living. So make sure you know the difference between what is living in an environment that does the selection for evolution versus what is non-living that also influences evolution. But these are the non-living factors that determine whether or not a species will survive. Remember back when we talked about the plants that were C4 plants that had adapted to the low moisture and high temperature environments of the desert? That's an example of how non-living components of an environment can select for what can exist in that environment. Okay, so you're going to have questions on mutation. Make sure you understand that mutations are slow and random. But these are the only principle that creates new alleles. All of the others merely select for it. Sexual selection, gene flow, genetic drift, and natural selection. These are all selection processes. Mutation, that's where all variation comes from, all new alleles. But it's random. So it's not going to say, oh, I need to survive. Let's rapidly mutate to be able to develop resistance to this antibiotic. No, that's not how it works. It's slow and random, but it is the core principle of evolution. Without this, none of these other principles would even exist because there would be no diversity. Okay, so the final 5 questions on your exam will essentially be on these 5 principles as well.